The sound of the heavy, reinforced glass of the Oval Office shattering wasn't just a breach, it was the sound of the world ending. It was 3:14 a.m., the graveyard shift at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and I was 3 feet away from the Resolute desk when the first scream tore through the West Wing. It didn't sound like a person. It sounded like a piece of rusted metal being dragged across a chalkboard. I'm a 10-year veteran of the Secret Service, trained to take a bullet for the man in the chair. But nothing prepares you for the smell of ozone, mixed with the copper tang of fresh blood in the most secure room on the planet. I remember the president looking at me, his face a mask of pale confusion, before the shadow hit the window again. A second later, the undefeatable glass turned into 1,000 diamonds on the carpet. Something rolled inside. It was wearing a uniformed division jacket, but the neck was twisted at a 90-degree angle, and its eyes were gone, replaced by 2 pits of milky, vibrating rot. My Sig Sauer was out before I could think. Double tap to the chest. The thwip-thwip of the suppressor felt useless, as the thing didn't even flinch. It just kept crawling, its fingernails screeching against the floorboards. This wasn't a coup. It wasn't a terror attack. It was the collapse. "Package is moving!" I roared into my comms, but all I got back was a chaotic symphony of static and wet, crunching noises. I grabbed the president by the shoulder, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. We didn't go for the door. The door was where the screaming was coming from. We went for the hidden panel near the fireplace, the one that leads to the PSIS tunnels. The air in the hallway was thick, like breathing in a humid DC summer afternoon, but flavored with the stench of an open grave. As we sprinted down the narrow corridor, I saw Agent Miller, a guy I'd shared 1,000 coffees with, pinned against the wall by 3 of them. They weren't biting him. They were tearing him open like a Christmas present. The sound of Miller's boots kicking rhythmically against the floorboards is something I still hear every time I close my eyes. I didn't stop to help. I couldn't. My duty was to the package, to the American dream that was currently bleeding out in the hallways of its own house. We hit the stairs, my boots slapping the cold concrete, the sound echoing up from the depths like a countdown. "Keep moving, sir. Don't look back," I yelled. I could hear them behind us, the wet slap of bare feet and a rattling breath of things that shouldn't be breathing. The security lights were flickering, that cold, blue LED strobe that makes everything look like a stop-motion nightmare. We reached the heavy steel doors of the bunker, and for a second, I thought we were safe. Then, I saw the hand caught in the doorframe. It was a woman's hand, manicured, wearing a wedding ring that caught the emergency light. Behind the door, the screaming was internal. The bunker hadn't been a sanctuary. It had been a trap. Someone had turned inside the most secure room in the world. I pivoted, my mind racing through tactical options that didn't exist. There was no backup coming. The radio was dead. The White House, the symbol of global power, was a slaughterhouse. We doubled back, heading for the motor pool. If we could get to the beast, the armored limo, maybe we could break out of the gates and head for Raven Rock. But as we emerged back into the ground level, I saw the south lawn. It was a sea of moving shadows, thousands of them, attracted by the sirens and the fires lighting up the DC skyline. The Washington Monument stood in the distance, a silent tombstone against a sky turned orange by the burning city. My suburban house in Arlington, my golden retriever, my wife, they were all gone. I knew it in that moment. The security we'd built, the walls, the protocols, they were just tissue paper. I checked my magazine. 12 rounds left. 12 rounds to save the president, or more likely, to make sure we didn't end up like Miller. I looked at the man I was sworn to protect. He was shaking, clutching a commemorative pen like it was a weapon. "What now, Agent?" he whispered. I didn't have an answer. I just had the weight of my gun and the sound of the glass shattering again, this time from the floors above us. The rot was inside, and the only way out was through the heart of the nightmare. The glass didn't just break, it shrieked. It was the sound of the world's most expensive security measures failing in a single jagged chorus. I didn't wait for the president to find his feet. I grabbed the lapel of his charcoal suit jacket and yanked him toward the heavy oak door of the Roosevelt room. My boots skidding on a floor that was slick with something I didn't want to identify in the dim emergency lighting. The sirens outside were shifting pitch, becoming a distorted mechanical wail that mimicked the screams echoing from the press briefing room. Every instinct I had, years of muscle memory drilled into me at Glencoe and honed through countless shifts of mind-numbing vigilance, told me to get him to the PSA. But the PSA was a tomb now. Miller was down there, and if Miller was down there, changed into one of those twitching, biting things, then the bunkers were just high-end larders for the undead. I could feel the president's pulse through his sleeve, thready, fast, the rhythm of a man who had realized the nuclear codes were useless against a threat that didn't have a heartbeat. We hit the hallway just as a silhouette vaulted over the balcony railing from the second floor. It hit the carpet with a wet thud. Limbs splayed at impossible angles, but it didn't stay down. It hissed, a sound like steam escaping a radiator, and scrambled toward us on all fours. I didn't think. I raised the Sig Sauer P229, one round to the high chest to stop the momentum, one to the ocular cavity. The muffled pops of the suppressed weapon felt pathetically small against the backdrop of the city's collapse. The thing, a former social secretary I recognized from the morning briefing, collapsed back into a heap of silk and gore. 11 rounds left. The weight of that number felt like a physical pressure on my chest. 11 rounds to cross a landscape that had become a Bosch painting. I shoved the president toward the service stairs, ignoring his stuttered protests. "Move, sir. Don't look at them. Just move." The air in the West Wing was thick with the smell of copper and the acrid smoke of an electrical fire somewhere in the basement. We passed a doorway where a pile of bodies blocked the path. They weren't all dead. Some were shifting, a slow-motion sea of grasping hands and gnashing teeth. I steered him away, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every shadow was a threat. Every creak of the floorboards was a death sentence. I found myself thinking of the dog, Cooper. He'd probably been the first to go. He was too friendly. He'd have walked right up to the neighbors with his tail wagging while they tore his throat out. I shoved the image down, burying it under a layer of cold professional detachment. If I started mourning now, I'd be dead before we hit the lawn. We reached a supply closet near the rose garden exit. I kicked it open, sweeping the small space with my weapon. Empty. I pushed the president inside and stood in the doorway, my eyes scanning the corridor. "Stay here. Do not make a sound," I whispered. He just nodded, his eyes wide and glazed, still clutching that damn pen. I checked a fallen officer near the door. Agent Henderson. He'd been cat. Tactical gear still mostly intact. I knelt, my hands shaking as I stripped the spare magazines from his vest. 3 mags, 36 rounds of .357 SIG. It felt like finding a gold mine in a desert. I also took his radio, though the static coming from it was a dissonant wall of noise, punctuated only by the occasional, frantic mayday that cut out mid-sentence. I looked out through the reinforced glass of the exit door. The south lawn was a nightmare. The emergency floodlights were still active, casting long, dancing shadows across the grass. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, drawn by the noise. They moved with a jerky, erratic grace, wandering aimlessly until a sound or a flash of light snapped them into a frenzy. In the distance, the silhouette of a downed Marine One lay crumpled like a discarded toy, its rotors bent and silent. No rescue was coming from the air. We were on our own. I turned back to the president. He looked diminished, the authority of his office stripped away by the sheer absurdity of the situation. "Sir, we're going to make a run for the motorcade garage. The beast is armored. It's our best shot at getting out of the blast zone of whatever's happening in the city." I didn't tell him that the city was already gone. I didn't tell him that the armored glass of the limo would only keep them out for so long if we got stuck. I just needed him to move. We stepped out into the night air, and the sound hit me first, a low, constant drone of moaning that sounded like the wind through a graveyard. The smell followed, a cloyingly sweet stench of decay mixed with the ozone of the burning city. We stayed low, hugging the shadows of the colonnade. My tactical light was off. I didn't want to draw their eyes. We moved in a crouch, my hand on the back of his neck, guiding him. We were 20 yards from the garage when the first one saw us. It was a groundskeeper, or what was left of one, his overalls shredded and his jaw hanging by a single tendon. He let out a rasping howl that was instantly answered by a dozen others. "Run!" I hissed. We broke cover. The president stumbled, his dress shoes sliding on the grass. But I hauled him up, my boots churning the dirt. They were closing in from the flanks, dark shapes emerging from the gloom of the trees. I fired on the move, double taps, focused and clinical. 1 down. 2. A third took around to the shoulder and didn't even flinch, its momentum carrying it toward us. I shoved the president ahead and pivoted, planting a round squarely in the creature's forehead. The spray of black fluid hit my face, cold and oily. I didn't wipe it off. I couldn't. We reached the heavy steel doors of the garage just as the first wave hit the perimeter. I punched the emergency override code into the keypad, my fingers slick with sweat. The red light blinked. Once, twice. Then, with a groan of hydraulics, the door began to slide upward. It was too slow. A hand, gray and skeletal, reached under the rising door, followed by another. I kicked at them, the heavy tread of my boot crunching bone, and shoved the president through the narrowing gap. Inside, the garage was a cathedral of shadows. The beast sat there, a black monolith of steel and Kevlar, reflecting the flickering overhead lights. I hit the door close button and leaned against the cold metal, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Outside, the pounding began. Thud, thud, thud. Hundreds of hands striking the steel. A rhythmic, mindless percussion. "Get in," I ordered, pointing to the rear door of the limo. I scrambled into the driver's seat, the familiar smell of leather and high-end electronics, a jarring contrast to the carnage outside. The engine roared to life with a comforting rumble, the V8 power a promise of survival. I looked at the monitors on the dash. The external cameras showed a sea of faces pressed against the garage door, eyes milky and vacant, mouths opening and closing in a silent hunger. I put the vehicle in gear. "Hold on, sir. I didn't wait for the door to fully open." I slammed the accelerator down. The beast surged forward, the heavy reinforced bumper catching the bottom of the rising door and tearing it upward. We exploded out into the night, the suspension groaning as we ran over the bodies piled against the entrance. It felt like driving over a series of wet logs. The lurching of the car was punctuated by the wet thuds of impact. The south lawn was a gauntlet. I steered the 7-ton vehicle through the crowds, the heavy glass cracking, but holding as the creatures threw themselves at the windows, their faces smeared against the panes, leaving trails of gore and gray matter. The president was curled in a ball in the back, his hands over his ears. I couldn't blame him. The sound of the undead being crushed under the wheels was a sound that would haunt a man's dreams if he lived long enough to have them. I veered toward the southeast gate, the one that led toward Pennsylvania Avenue. The city beyond was a furnace. The fires had spread, leaping from building to building, fed by the gas lines and the chaos. The Washington Monument was framed by a backdrop of roiling black smoke and embers that drifted through the air like fireflies. As we breached the gate, the scale of the devastation became clear. The streets were choked with abandoned cars, their doors flung open, their interiors painted red. There were no sirens anymore, no distant shouts of the living, just the crackle of the flames and the endless, shuffling movement of the dead. I navigated the beast onto the sidewalk, the heavy tires mounting the curb to bypass a pileup of buses. I looked at the fuel gauge, 3/4 of a tank. In this beast, that wouldn't get us as far as I wanted. We needed to get out of the city, away from the density of the population. But every bridge was a choke point. The 14th Street Bridge would be a graveyard. Key Bridge would be worse. I checked the dash-mounted GPS, but the satellites were failing, the map flickering and resetting. I had to rely on memory. "Where are we going?" The president's voice came over the intercom, thin and trembling. "Away from the lights, sir," I replied, though I didn't know if there was anywhere left that wasn't burning. I steered toward the back streets, avoiding the main arteries where the clusters of infected were thickest. We passed a playground where the swings were still moving in the hot wind, a lone shoe lying in the sand. My heart twinged. Arlington. My house was only a few miles away. I could almost see the street, the white picket fence I'd spent all last summer painting. I knew they were gone, but the urge to go there, to see the ruins of my life, was a physical ache. I pushed it down. I was a Secret Service agent. I had a job. The mission was the only thing that kept the madness at bay. Suddenly, the beast lurched violently to the left. A massive explosion had leveled a storefront half a block ahead, sending a shockwave that shattered what was left of the nearby windows. A plume of fire erupted into the sky, illuminating a horde that occupied the entire intersection. They weren't just wandering. They were chasing something. A Humvee, its turret spinning wildly, was trying to push through the mass. I saw the muzzle flashes of the .50 cal, saw the bodies of the dead being shredded like paper, but there were too many of them. They were clambering over the sides of the military vehicle, dragging the gunner down into the mosh pit of teeth. "God," the president whispered. I didn't look. I reversed, the tires screaming as I spun the heavy limo in a tight arc. We needed a different route. I headed toward the river, thinking maybe we could find a way through the parklands. But as we turned onto a side street, I saw the barricade. It wasn't made of cars or rubble. It was made of people, hundreds of them, huddled together behind a line of overturned police cruisers, their faces illuminated by the glow of handheld flares. They were alive, and they were standing directly in our path. I slowed down. My training said to keep moving, that the mission was the man in the back, not the civilians on the street. But these people saw the presidential seal on the door. They saw the flags on the fenders. They saw hope. They began to surge toward the car, their hands reaching out, their mouths moving in desperate pleas I couldn't hear through the armored glass. "Help us! Please!" I could read the words on their lips. Behind them, the shadows were closing in. The horde from the intersection had heard the commotion and was turning their attention toward the new source of noise. If I stopped, we'd be swarmed. If I didn't, I'd have to drive through them. The moral weight of it felt like a mountain on my shoulders. I looked in the rearview mirror at the president. He was looking at the people, his face a mask of horror. He knew what I was thinking. He knew the calculus of survival. "Keep going, Agent," he whispered, his voice cracking. We can't stop." I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, a silent apology to a God I no longer believed in, and I pressed the accelerator. The impact was soft, sickeningly so. The screams were drowned out by the roar of the engine. I didn't look at the faces. I focused on the gap between the police cruisers, the beast's heavy frame shrugging off the obstacles. We broke through, the car covered in a fresh layer of gore, and plunged back into the darkness of the riverside parks. The silence in the car was absolute, a heavy, suffocating thing. I felt a piece of my soul break off and drift away into the orange-tinged night. We were alive, but the world we were trying to save was already a corpse. I checked the dash. The engine temperature was climbing. We'd taken damage to the radiator in the breakout. Steam began to hiss from the edges of the hood, a white veil that obscured my vision. We weren't going to make it out of the city in this car. I scanned the darkness, looking for a place to hole up, a place where I could find a different vehicle, more ammo, maybe a moment of peace. I saw it then, a small boathouse on the edge of the Potomac. It was isolated, surrounded by a high chain-link fence. It wasn't much, but it was defensible. I steered the dying limo toward it, the engine knocking and sputtering. We rolled through the gate just as the V8 gave its final, shuddering gasp and died. The silence that followed was terrifying. No engine, no sirens, just the sound of the wind through the reeds and the distant, muffled roar of the burning Capitol. I stepped out of the car, my gun raised, my eyes scanning the perimeter. The air was cold now, the heat of the fires not reaching this far. I opened the rear door. The president didn't move at first. He just sat there, looking at the pen in his hand. Then, slowly, he stepped out into the mud. We were two ghosts in a world of monsters. I looked back at the city. The Washington Monument was a jagged tooth against the fire, and I realized then that the nightmare wasn't ending. It was just beginning. The heart of the nightmare wasn't the White House, or the zombies, or the burning streets. It was the realization that in order to survive, we were becoming the very things we feared, mindless, driven only by the instinct to keep moving, leaving a trail of bodies in our wake. I checked my magazine. 12 rounds left in the current mag, 48 total. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. "Come on, sir," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. "We have to find a boat." He followed me, a shadow behind a shadow, as we walked toward the dark water of the Potomac, the rot following close behind. The mud of the Potomac Basin didn't just cling. It pulled, a cold, hungry suction that felt like the earth itself was trying to drag us down into the dark. Every step was a tactical calculation. The president, the most powerful man in a world that no longer existed, stumbled behind me, his expensive wool trousers caked in filth, his breathing ragged and thin. I didn't help him. I couldn't. My hands were occupied with the Sig Sauer, my eyes scanning the reeds, the shadows of the boathouses, and the oily black surface of the water. The river didn't look like water anymore. It looked like ink, reflecting the orange glow of the burning Capitol behind us. The smell was a sickening cocktail of swamp gas, jet fuel, and that sweet, metallic tang of rot that had become the new atmosphere of the United States. We reached the edge of the Thompson Boat Center. Usually, this place was a postcard of rowing shells and collegiate athletes. Now, it was a graveyard of splintered wood and fiberglass. The pier groaned under the weight of the tide, or maybe the weight of what was clinging to the pilings. I saw a movement to my left, a pale, bloated shape shifting behind an overturned skull. I didn't waste a bullet. I stepped forward, the transition from mud to wooden planks, loud as a gunshot in the dead air, and brought the butt of my weapon down into the thing's skull. It went down with a wet crunch, sliding back into the water without a sound. It didn't have a face left, just a jagged hole where a jaw should have been. The president made a small, choked noise in his throat. I turned, grabbing his shoulder with a grip that was probably too hard, bruising the skin through his suit jacket. I needed him to stay sharp, but looking into his eyes, I saw the vacuum. The man was gone. There was only a vessel left, a package I was sworn to deliver to a destination that probably didn't exist. I shoved him toward a sleek, black-hulled, rigid-hull, inflatable boat, an RHIAB, tethered at the end of the dock. It was a Coast Guard interceptor, tactical, fast, and most importantly, fueled. I felt a surge of something like hope, but in this new world, hope was just a precursor to a harder fall. As I reached for the mooring line, a red laser dot splashed across my chest. I froze. It danced upward, settling right between my eyes. I didn't reach for my holster. I knew that dot. It was a steady, disciplined hover, the mark of a shooter who wasn't afraid. From the shadows of the marina office, a figure stepped out. He was wearing the same tactical gear I was, the same star pin on his lapel, but his face was a mask of soot and dried blood. It was Miller, my training officer, the man who had stood at my wedding. He held a MK-18 carbine leveled at my head, his finger married to the trigger. For a second, the only sound was the distant roar of the fires and the lap of the water against the pilings. Miller didn't look at the president. He looked at me, and his eyes were dead. He wasn't infected. He was worse. He was awake. He told me to step away from the boat, his voice a flat, hollow drone that bypassed any sense of camaraderie we'd built over a decade of service. I asked him what he was doing, and he just gestured with the barrel toward the president. He told me the football, the nuclear briefcase, wasn't with us, so the man was just a liability, a mouth to feed that would only scream when the shadows started moving. Miller had a plan, he said. There was a fallback point in the Blue Ridge, a private contractor site with air filtration and supplies for 20 years. But they weren't taking politicians who let the world die. They were only taking the muscle. He wanted me to leave the president there, on the dock, as bait to distract the swarm that was currently pouring over the Key Bridge, and take the boat with him. The betrayal hit harder than any physical blow. This was the Secret Service. We were the inanimate objects, the shields that didn't think, only acted. And here was Miller, the best of us, discarding the oath like a piece of scrap paper. The president finally spoke, his voice trembling but clear, asking Miller if there was word from the Joint Chiefs. Miller laughed, a jagged, ugly sound, and told him the Joint Chiefs were currently being eaten in a bunker beneath the Pentagon. The reality of it crashed down on us then. The total decapitation of the world's last superpower. While we stood there, the sound of the horde intensified. They were coming down the bank, hundreds of them, their footsteps a rhythmic, shuffling thunder. I looked at Miller, then at the president, then back at the boat. I told Miller I couldn't do it. He didn't hesitate. He shifted his aim to the president's chest, his knuckle whitening on the trigger. He said if I wouldn't leave him, he'd just make the decision for me. In that split second, the world slowed into the high-definition clarity of a gunfight. I didn't draw my sig. It was too slow. Instead, I lunged at the president, tackling him into the freezing water of the Potomac just as Miller's carbine barked. The round whistled through the air where the president's head had been a millisecond before, shattering a glass light fixture on the dock. We hit the water, the cold hitting me like a physical punch, knocking the air from my lungs. The weight of my gear, the plates in my vest, the ammo, it all wanted to pull me to the bottom. I kicked frantically, clawing at the surface, catching a glimpse of Miller through the slats of the dock. He was repositioning, cursing, looking for a clear shot through the water. Then the water around us began to boil. It wasn't Miller's bullets, it was the floaters. Dozens of them, submerged and bloated, had been stirred by our splash. A hand, white and shriveled like a dead fish, grabbed my ankle. I kicked out, feeling the soft give of decomposed flesh. I found the president's collar and hauled him toward the underside of the dock, tucking us into the shadows of the crossbeams. Above us, the wooden planks vibrated with Miller's footsteps. He was pacing, looking for us, but he wasn't alone anymore. The first wave of the horde reached the marina. I heard the frantic, rhythmic popping of his carbine as he began to engage the dead. It was a symphony of slaughter. The wet thud of bullets hitting meat, the guttural snarls of the infected, and Miller's screaming commands to a team that wasn't there. I held the president's head above water, my arm locked around a slimy piling. He was shivering violently, his eyes rolling back. I had to make a choice. Let the dead take Miller and risk them finding us, or use the chaos to get back to the boat. I chose the latter. I waited until I heard the metallic clack of Miller's bolt locking back, an empty magazine. I hauled the president up onto the opposite side of the boat, the RHIAB acting as a shield between us and the dock. I climbed over the gunwale, my muscles screaming, and saw Miller fumbling with a fresh mag. His eyes met mine through the center console's glass. There was no apology in them, only a frantic, animalistic need to survive. Behind him, a dozen infected were closing in, their fingers reaching, their mouths unhinged. I reached for the ignition. The keys were there, standard protocol for emergency vessels. Miller lunged for the boat, his hand catching the railing as I turned the key. The twin outboards roared to life, a beautiful, violent scream that drowned out the dead. I slammed the throttle forward. The boat lurched, the bow rising. Miller was dragged for a second, his boots skimming the water, his eyes pleading now. He was my brother. He had saved my life in a dozen training exercises and 2 real-world deployments, but he had broken the one thing that kept us human in this hell. I looked him right in the face as the boat gained speed, and I didn't reach out. I didn't help him. I watched as the force of the wake tore his grip loose. He fell back into the churning water, and before he could even surface, the first of the infected jumped from the dock onto him. He didn't scream. He just disappeared under a carpet of gray limbs and snapping teeth. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I pushed the throttle to the stops, the RHIB leaping across the black water, leaving the burning silhouette of the Lincoln Memorial behind us. The wind whipped the heat of the city away, replacing it with a biting, salt-tinged chill. We were moving toward the Chesapeake, a vast, dark unknown. I looked at the president. He was curled in the deck's center, staring at the floorboards. The pen was gone. He'd lost it in the river. He looked at his empty hand, then at me. He asked me where we were going. I looked at the fuel gauge, 3/4 full. I looked at the darkness ahead, where the horizon met the bay, and realized I didn't have an answer. There was no green zone. There was no Mount Weather. There was only the water and the things that waited beneath it. The river widened as we passed Alexandria. The city was a funeral pyre, the smoke blotting out the stars. On the banks, I could see the flickers of flashlights. Survivors signaling for help. I ignored them. Every light was a trap, every cry a siren song that would lead to a dead end. My heart was a cold stone in my chest. I had killed Miller in every way that mattered. I had become the thing I told myself I was protecting the world from, a killer who prioritized one life over everything else, not out of duty, but out of a mechanical, unthinking adherence to a code that no longer had a country. We hit a patch of debris, a fleet of pleasure boats that had collided and burned near the National Harbor. I had to slow down, weaving the RHIB through the charred husks. The silence here was worse than the noise of the city. It was heavy, thick with the smell of scorched plastic and hair. Something bumped against the hull. I peered over the side, expecting a log. It was a woman, her life jacket keeping her upright, her eyes wide and milky, staring up at me as the boat's wake rolled her over. She was one of thousands. The Potomac was a conveyor belt of the damned, carrying the wreckage of the Capitol out to the sea. "Agent," the president whispered. He was standing now, gripping the center console. His voice was different. The shock had hardened into something brittle and sharp. The sat phone in the console. "Is it encrypted?" I opened the compartment. The ruggedized phone was there, its blue light blinking. "Yes, sir, but the towers are down. We're relying on the constellation, and if the ground stations are overrun..." I didn't finish. I handed him the phone. He punched in a code with steady fingers. He waited, the speakerphone emitting a haunting rhythmic hum of static. Then a voice broke through. It wasn't a human voice. It was an automated broadcast, a looping signal on a high-priority military frequency. "Clementine is dark. Repeat, Clementine is dark. All assets are authorized for Phase 3. God save the Republic." The president dropped the phone. It clattered on the deck, the loop continuing. "Phase 3, he murmured. I knew what that meant. We all did. It was the scorched earth protocol. If the government couldn't be preserved, the infrastructure was to be denied to the enemy. In this case, the enemy was the entire population of the eastern seaboard. They were going to level the cities, not with nukes, that would ruin the land for too long, but with thermobaric ordnance, fuel-air explosives that would turn the oxygen in the streets into fire. I looked back at Washington. For a moment, the sky seemed to shiver. Then, a series of white flashes ignited on the horizon, far to the north, toward Baltimore. A few seconds later, the sound reached us, a low, bowel-shaking rumble that felt like the earth cracking open. Then another flash, closer this time, near Dulles. They were sanitizing the map. They were killing the monsters by killing the world. "We have to get further out," I said, my voice cracking. "The pressure wave will capsize us if we're in the open water." I pushed the boat harder, the engines screaming in protest as we pounded against the chop of the widening river. The president didn't sit down. He stood there, watching the horizon, the fire reflecting in his pupils. He looked like a man watching his own funeral. We were nearing the mouth of the bay when the sky behind us turned a blinding, bruised purple. The shockwave hit a minute later. It wasn't a wall of water. It was a wall of air. It slammed into the back of the boat, nearly throwing me over the console. The RHIAB skittered across the surface like a flat stone, the engines cavitating as the prop lost bite. I fought the wheel, my muscles tearing as the roar of the explosion swallowed everything. It was the sound of millions of lives being extinguished in a heartbeat. The heat followed, a warm, sickly breeze that smelled of ozone and dust. When the world finally settled, the glow behind us was gone. There was only a thick, impenetrable wall of black smoke that rose miles into the atmosphere, lit from below by the dying embers of a civilization. The radio was silent now. The automated loop had stopped. We were alone in the middle of the Chesapeake, the boat drifting as the engines finally sputtered and died, choked by the ash that was beginning to fall like gray snow. I sat there, my hands still fused to the wheel, and felt the weight of the silence. It was the loudest thing I had ever heard. The president walked to the stern. He looked at the water, then at the ash coating his sleeves. He reached out, catching a flake of it on his finger. "That's them," he said, his voice a ghost of a whisper. "That's the people I was supposed to lead." He looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see a leader or a package. I saw a man who had realized that he was the last of his kind, a king of nothing. I checked my weapon. 11 rounds in the mag, 47 total. The ash continued to fall, covering the boat, covering us, turning everything the same uniform shade of deathly gray. I realized then that survival wasn't a victory. It was just a longer road to the same end. I reached down, picked up the sat phone, and threw it into the dark water. We didn't need to listen to the world die anymore. We were already gone. "What now?" the president asked. I stood up, the joints in my knees popping, and looked toward the dark smudge of the eastern shore. "Now," I said, "we keep moving, because the only thing worse than being a ghost is being one that stays still." I grabbed the manual pull start for the auxiliary motor. I pulled once, twice. On the third try, the small engine sputtered into life, a tiny defiant heartbeat in the middle of a dead ocean. We turned away from the fire and headed into the fog, two shadows in a world that had finally run out of light. The auxiliary motor was a rhythmic, agonizing pulse in the silence of the Chesapeake, a mechanical heartbeat that felt far too loud for a world that had gone quiet. We cut through the fog like a blade through a shroud, the salt air mixing with the acrid, lingering stench of the burning Capitol behind us. For hours, neither of us spoke. The president sat in the stern, his expensive wool overcoat ruined, stained with grease, and the dark, dried ichor of things that shouldn't have been walking. He looked smaller than he had in the Oval Office. The weight of the world hadn't just crushed his spirit. It had physically bowed his frame. I kept my hand on the tiller, my eyes scanning the gray-on-gray horizon. The bay was littered with the detritus of a civilization that had tripped over its own feet. We passed an overturned pleasure cruiser, its white hull bobbing like the belly of a dead fish, and later, the floating remains of a life jacket that looked too small to belong to an adult. I didn't point it out. There was no point in cataloging the tragedies anymore. Every mile we traveled was another mile away from the oath I'd taken, yet somehow The duty felt heavier than ever. I wasn't protecting a leader anymore. I was protecting a memory. When the fuel finally ran out, the motor didn't cough or sputter. It simply died, leaving us in a silence so profound it made my ears ring. We drifted for what felt like an eternity, the gentle lap of water against the aluminum hull, the only indicator that we were still moving. The fog began to thin as the sun, a pale, sickly disk behind the clouds, started to climb. Eventually, the dark, jagged line of the eastern shore emerged from the haze. It wasn't the welcoming sight I'd hoped for. It was a coastline of skeletal trees and rotting piers, the marshes of Dorchester County stretching out like a drowned graveyard. I grabbed the oars. They were old, the wood splintered and rough against my calloused palms, but I pulled with everything I had left. Every stroke sent a flare of pain through my shoulders, a reminder of the frantic scramble down the White House stairs and the desperate fight on the lawn. My suit jacket was gone, left somewhere in the dark water. I was down to my tactical vest and a sweat-stained shirt, the badge on my belt, the only thing connecting me to the man I used to be. We hit the mud 50 yards from the actual shoreline. The boat grounded with a soft, wet thud. I stepped out, the muck swallowing my boots up to the shins, and reached back for the president. He took my hand, his grip surprisingly firm, and we waded through the reeds. The marshes were alive with the sound of insects, a buzzing, humming indifference to the end of humanity that felt like an insult. We reached a strip of gravel road that wound through the salt hay, the asphalt cracked and overtaken by weeds. To our left, an abandoned crab shack sat hunched against the wind, its windows shattered like hollow eyes. I drew my P229, the weight of it a cold comfort. The air here didn't smell like smoke. It smelled of salt, rot, and stagnant water. It was the smell of the earth reclaiming itself. "Where are we going, Special Agent?" the president asked. His voice was raspy, the authority stripped away, leaving only the man. "Away from the water, sir," I replied, my eyes scanning the tree line. "We need high ground and a vantage point. And we need to find out if there's anyone left who hasn't forgotten how to be human." We walked for miles. The eastern shore was a labyrinth of back roads and isolated farms, a place that had always felt decades behind the rest of the country. Now, it felt like it had slipped into a different century entirely. We found a farmhouse around noon. It was a white, 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch, sitting at the end of a long driveway lined with oaks. A silver minivan sat in the yard, its driver's side door hanging open. There were no bodies, which was worse in a way. It meant they'd had time to run, or time to be taken. I signaled for the president to stay low behind a stone wall while I cleared the perimeter. The silence was heavy, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. I moved toward the house, my boots crunching softly on the gravel. I checked the windows. Empty. The front door was unlocked. I stepped inside, the air smelling of stale coffee and lavender. It was a tomb of middle-class normalcy. A half-finished crossword puzzle sat on the kitchen table. A child's backpack was dumped by the stairs. Clear. I whispered into the house, though there was no one to hear me. I beckoned the president inside. He collapsed into a kitchen chair, staring at a family photo on the refrigerator. It showed a young couple and 2 girls grinning in front of the very house we were now trespassing in. The president looked away, his eyes watering. I didn't offer any comfort. I couldn't. I went to the pantry and found 3 cans of peaches and a box of crackers. I cracked a can open with my knife and handed it to him. He ate with a frantic, desperate hunger, the syrup dripping down his chin. I ate the crackers, my throat so dry it felt like swallowing glass. I had the codes, he said suddenly, his voice hollow. I had the power to level cities, to reshape the map of the world, and I couldn't stop a virus. I couldn't save my own garden. Nobody could, sir, I said, leaning against the counter, my eyes never leaving the window. This wasn't a war we were trained for. There's no doctrine for the dead coming back. I should have stayed, he muttered, in the bunker. I should have gone down with the ship. You'd be a trophy in a cage right now if you had, I said bluntly. Or worse, my job was to keep you alive. I intend to finish the job. To what end? He asked, looking up at me. So I can be the president of a graveyard? So I can presiding over the ashes? So there's a witness, I said, so someone remembers how it was supposed to work. We stayed in the house until the shadows grew long. I found a hunting rifle in a gun cabinet upstairs, a Remington 700 with a decent scope, and a box of .306 rounds. It was better than the handgun for what was coming. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, I saw them. They were coming out of the woods at the edge of the property. Not a horde, but a trickle. 6, maybe 7. They moved with that distinctive jerky gait, their limbs moving in ways anatomy shouldn't allow. They were drawn to the house, perhaps by the scent of the living, or perhaps just by the lingering echo of what this place used to be. I didn't use the rifle. I didn't want the noise. I pulled my knife and went out the back door. It was a cold, clinical business. The first one was wearing a flannel shirt, its jaw hanging by a single tendon. I stepped inside its reach and drove the blade through the base of its skull. It went limp, a sack of wasted meat. The others were slow, uncoordinated. I moved through them like a ghost, a dancer in a macabre ballroom. I didn't feel fear, only a grim, mechanical necessity. When the last one fell, its blood soaking into the manicured lawn, I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cooling air. I looked at my hands. They were stained, but they didn't shake. I realized then that I had become a different kind of animal. The Secret Service agent had died in the tunnels beneath the White House. This thing, this survivor, was something new. I went back inside and found the president standing by the window. He'd seen it all. He didn't look horrified. He looked impressed, which was even more unsettling. "You're very good at that," he said. "It's just math, sir," I replied. "Distance, timing, and force." That night, we sat in the dark. We didn't dare light a fire. We talked in low tones about the world that was. He told me about his first campaign, the way the light felt on the stage in Des Moines, the hope he'd seen in the eyes of the crowds. I told him about my father, a cop in Philly who taught me that the badge wasn't a shield, but a weight you chose to carry. We weren't a leader and his guard anymore. We were two survivors sharing a foxhole at the end of time. The next morning, we moved out at dawn. I'd found a map in the minivan. There was a small private airfield about 10 miles north, used by local farmers and wealthy weekenders. It was a long shot, but it was a goal. We skirted the main roads, sticking to the drainage ditches and the edges of the fields. The president was flagging, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I had to carry his pack, and eventually, I had to let him lean on me. We were a pathetic sight, the most powerful man in the world and his last protector. Limping through the mud of Maryland, we reached the airfield by mid-afternoon. It was a single asphalt strip with a couple of corrugated metal hangars. A small Cessna was parked on the apron, its nose pointed toward the sky. My heart leaped. If we could get in the air, we could find a place the infection hadn't reached. An island, a mountain redoubt, somewhere. But as we approached, I saw the problem. The airfield wasn't empty. A group of men were there. Not zombies, but men. They were armed with shotguns and hunting rifles, standing around a communal fire built in a 55-gallon drum. They looked hard, weathered, and wary. This was the New World Order, tribes and territory. I told the president to wait in the tall grass at the edge of the fence. I approached with my hands raised, the Remington slung over my shoulder, barrel down. "Easy," I shouted. "I'm coming in. I'm unarmed, mostly." A man in a camouflage jacket stepped forward, leveling a double barrel at my chest. "That's far enough, stranger. We don't want no more mouths to feed, and we sure as hell don't want whatever sickness you might be carrying." "I'm not sick," I said, my voice steady, "and I'm not looking for a handout. I've got a passenger, someone who needs a seat on that plane." The man laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "That plane ain't going nowhere. No fuel, and the pilot's dead in that hangar over there. We're just waiting for the end of the world in style." "I can get fuel," I lied. I didn't know if I could, but I needed them to listen. "And I can fly. I was military before I was what I am now." The man narrowed his eyes. He looked at my tactical vest, at the way I stood. He knew I was a professional. "Who's your passenger? Your kid? Your wife?" I hesitated. If I told them who he was, they might kill him out of spite for the government that failed them. Or they might see him as a meal ticket. Either way, the truth was a gamble. I looked back at the grass where the president was hidden. He chose that moment to walk out. He didn't hide. He didn't cower. He walked with the dignity of his office, his head held high despite the filth on his face. He walked right up to the man with the shotgun. "I am the President of the United States," he said, his voice echoing across the quiet airfield. "And this man is my primary detail. We are requesting your assistance under the authority of the federal government." The men around the fire went silent. The man with the shotgun stared at him, his mouth falling open. Then, slowly, he began to chuckle. The chuckle turned into a laugh, a loud booming sound that seemed to shake the very air. "The president? You hear that, boys? The king of the dead has come to visit." I moved. Then, faster than they could react, I didn't draw the rifle. I drew the P229 and put a round into the dirt at the man's feet. The laugh stopped instantly. The other men raised their weapons, but I had the leader in my sights. "The government is gone," I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming a serrated edge. "The cities are gone, the laws are gone, but I am still here, and I am the best at what I do. You can kill us, but I'll take 4 of you with me before I hit the ground. Or you can help us. You can be part of the story that doesn't end in a ditch." The leader looked at the hole in the dirt, then at me, then at the president. He saw the resolve in my eyes. He saw the strange, quiet power in the old man's face. He lowered his shotgun. "The plane really is dry, son," he said, his voice quieter now. "But there's a boat down at the marina, a real one, a trawler with a diesel engine and enough supplies to last a month. We were planning on heading out tomorrow, going to the islands in the Sound. Maybe the dead can't swim. We're coming with you," I said. It wasn't a request. "Fine," the man said, But the suit works for his keep. And you keep that gun pointed at the things in the woods, not at us. The journey to the marina was a blur of tension and sweat. We moved in a tight formation, the president in the middle. We encountered more of the dead stragglers from the nearby town, but the men knew the terrain. They dispatched them with a grim efficiency that reminded me of my own. By the time we reached the docks, the sun was setting for the last time on the world we knew. The trawler was a sturdy, ugly thing called the Mary Ann. It smelled of diesel and old fish, and to me, it looked like a cathedral. As we boarded, the president stopped at the gangplank. He looked back toward the west, toward the faint orange glow on the horizon. That was all that remained of Washington, D.C. He took a deep breath, the salt air filling his lungs. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled American flag, one that had flown from the front of his limousine. He looked at it for a long time, then handed it to me. "Keep this, Joe," he said. It was the first time he'd used my name, not for the country, for the man you were when you put it on. "I'm not that man anymore, sir," I said, taking the cloth. It felt light, almost weightless. "None of us are," he said, "but we have to be something. And being a survivor is a start." We cast off as the stars began to poke through the thinning clouds. The engine of the Mary Ann roared to life, a deep, guttural growl that felt like a promise. We moved out into the deep water, the wake trailing behind us like a silver ribbon. I stood at the rail, watching the shore recede until it was nothing more than a dark line against a darker sky. My gun was cleaned, my mag was full, and my heart was as cold and steady as the deep Atlantic. I looked at the president, who was sitting on a crate, talking to the men about the tides. He looked like a man who had finally found his level. I took the badge from my belt. I looked at the seal of the Secret Service, the star, the words, "worthy of trust and confidence." I thought about the men I'd lost, the halls I'd walked, and the world that had burned. I didn't throw it into the water. I put it in my pocket, next to the flag. I wasn't protecting a president anymore. I was protecting the future, however small and fragile it might be. The road wasn't ending. It was just changing direction. As the boat headed toward the open sea, away from the ruins of the old world and into the uncertainty of the new, I realized that survival wasn't a victory. It was a choice to keep moving, to keep breathing, and to keep watch. I was still a Secret Service agent, but my service was no longer a secret. It was the only thing left that mattered. I turned my back on the land and looked toward the dawn. The light was coming, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to see what it revealed. The ghosts were behind us. The living were ahead. And as long as I had a round in the chamber and a horizon to aim for, that was enough. It had to be enough. We were the last of the old world and the first of the new. And we were moving. Always moving.